Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, in particular because one of the points I'm going to be making today is that there is unfortunately a real lack of fora in the international community where it is possible to engage in a serious and frank debate about some of the challenges that the types of conflict we found ourselves in raise under international law. And maybe later I'll say a word about why it's so difficult to find those fora, but I simply have to express my appreciation to Ambassador Gold and Dr. Lars and the JCPA and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for putting together a forum like this, which can be the beginning of a discussion of this nature. The other general point that I would make is that although the heading of this panel is really pointing to why maybe international law is inadequate to the task of dealing with these conflicts, one of the points I'm going to be making is that before we can even think of amending international law, we have to actually preserve international law as it is at the moment, because one of the dangers that we face, as Ambassador Gold hinted in his opening remarks, is a slippage, is a sense that fundamental principles of international law are being whittled away, and that even things that are permissible in terms of international law are slowly being shaved away, and we're in danger of a slippery slope in terms of interpreting existing principles. I thought what I would do in this opening session was share with you what seemed to me some of the major challenges that an operation like the operation that we saw in Gaza earlier this year place before us in terms of international law. And before we do that, it's worth thinking about the interface between international law and a military operation. Where do legal advisors and international lawyers actually impact on the conduct of military operations? And I think it's fair to say that there's really 4 points of contact in relation to any general operation, and you can see them here. It's really, we have the point of contact prior to any conflict, once we find ourselves in a conflict, but pre a specific operation, actually during a military operation itself, and then following the military operation. So if we think briefly about what happens in each of those stages, prior to a conflict, then we have the involvement of international lawyers basically in training and preparing military forces. The IDF has a very sophisticated program of international law training for soldiers and officers. Since 2005, it's been compulsory part of officers' training. They've developed some very impressive computer software on humanitarian law issues, which is now being borrowed by other militaries across the world. And I think this is a less problematic area. It becomes more problematic when you talk about what the role of a legal advisor is, actually once you're inside a conflict situation. This is when in the Israeli system we have legal advice frameworks being activated with reserve officers and staff officers giving advice at headquarters and command level, participating in operational planning, actually being involved in the identification of targets. Moving on, actually during a military operation itself, we have an emergency legal advice mechanism running 24/7, a military advocate general center. We have lawyers participating in the daily situation meetings and so on. I'll just mention in passing that I think that this is a very complex question, and those of you who had a chance to read the protocols of the Winograd Commission looking into issues that arose out of the Lebanon conflict will know that it's a very complicated question. What should be the role of a legal advisor actually in time of military conflict? Do we want to send in military commanders into battle with legal advisors on their shoulders? Are we undermining the role that legal advisors may play in passing judgment after a conflict if they're actually involved in the decision making during the conflict and so on? So I just mark that as an area that I think needs to be given consideration. And finally, after a conflict, we have the lessons learned. Some of you may know that the military at the moment, the IDF, has concluded at least 5 very significant command investigations into general broad issues that arose out of the Gaza operation. In addition, there's any number of smaller investigations that are taking place into specific incidents. In the past, those sorts of investigations have led to disciplinary proceedings, criminal investigations, and so on. And obviously, there's important operational lessons to be learned. So that's a general overview of how international law gets into the military system. But what does it actually have to say about the conduct of operations? And I think very broadly it's fair to say that there are 4 key principles that come into play during the conduct of an operation. The first is military necessity. The second is what's called the principle of distinction. The third is proportionality. And the last is humanity. And I'll say a word about each of those, but at the outset I'll say that in a conflict of the nature that we faced, I think it's fair to say that the middle 2, distinction and proportionality, are the ones that create the most complicated dilemmas. First, a word about military necessity. Military necessity, the concept actually appears by implication in many of the instruments of international law, although it's not in fact enshrined specifically as a principle. I've brought here a quote by Napoleon Bonaparte as a sort of precedent, where he says, "My great maxim has been that every injury done to the enemy is excusable only insofar as it's absolutely necessary." What does the principle of necessity actually mean in practice? Well, it basically means confronting the adversary's weapons and ammunition, confronting their infrastructure, and protecting one's own forces. So if we think about that in terms of the Gaza operation, this, for example, on the left-hand side, we have a graph showing the number of missiles increasing over the 8 years prior to the operation. On the right-hand side, we have even more troublingly a map showing the increasing range of those missiles until finally it's missing a final line that would reach as far as Beersheba, placing at least 1 million civilians under the shadow of mortar rockets and missiles. In terms of infrastructure, primarily we have the problem of tunnels. Here's a map showing a number of the tunnels running between the Egypt and the Gaza Strip. Here we can see some of these smuggling tunnels, some of them with electricity, ventilation, railway tracks and so on. And force protection, I've put here just a photograph of Gilad Shalit as a reminder that one of the strategic goals of Hamas in this operation was actually to kidnap Israeli soldiers. And when you take that into account, that obviously has an important implication for operational planning. As I mentioned before, probably the most problematic, or one of the 2 most problematic areas or principles in this particular conflict, is the principle of distinction. And it's probably the most fundamental principle of the law of armed conflict. And it really focuses on the basic idea that we have to try and leave civilians out of the conflict. And it really has 2 dimensions. The first dimension is when we think about the adversary. When we think about the other side of the conflict, we have an obligation to distinguish between the adversary's civilians and combatants, and the additional protocol to the Geneva Convention says quite clearly that you can direct your military operations only against military objectives. I don't have a lot to say about this except to point out that it's quite clearly a principle that was roundly rejected by the Hamas. Here's an official Hamas poster, for example, on the left-hand side, where you can see at the bottom they are proudly displaying photographs of houses in Sderot that were attacked and damaged by their missiles. There's no sense that this was a violation of the principle of distinction. What's more complicated and more challenging in this conflict was the principle of distinction as it relates to your own side of the conflict. And here the principle is quite clearly that you are not allowed to try and render a military target immune from military operations by placing it in the heart of a civilian area. And if we look at some of the Hamas practice within the Gaza operation, we see in the top left-hand side, we see firing from rooftops, missiles, firing from populated areas on the top right-hand side. On the bottom right-hand side, we can see firing from the shadow or protection from behind a cemetery. And on the left-hand side at the bottom, we have, let me see if I can open this up for you, a remarkable piece of footage. Just one moment. This is actually a UN high school, a boys' school in Gaza. And if you look very carefully here, what you'll see is actually a rocket launcher being wheeled out of the school, actually being wheeled out of the school, fired, and then wheeled back into the school. And obviously the implication of this is that this doesn't just undermine the protection that should be afforded to this particular school, but it raises a very fundamental question about the degree of protection that can be, or the degree of immunity that can be afforded to schools throughout the Gaza Strip. Moving on. Other abuses. Here is a remarkable picture. This is a satellite photo of of the Gaza Strip, the Tel al-Zata area of the Gaza Strip. On the picture you can see obviously all the houses and all the houses, but you can also see scattered around, circled in yellow, what are called protected buildings, sensitive sites, UN facilities, schools, and so on and so forth. And also on this particular photograph, what you can see is a series of red dots. These dots are dots that have been plotted by a satellite system called TPQ, which identifies where missiles were fired during the course of the conflict. And if you look, for example, towards the top of the photograph, towards the right-hand side, you can see a stunning and quite chilling correlation between the clusters of red dots and the areas where there are sensitive sites, really demonstrating how the groups firing the missiles were deliberately hiding behind or locating themselves deliberately in the area of protected and sensitive sites. Moving on, there's other pictures similar. Here, for example, the red circle in the middle of the picture is actually a missile launcher. And what you can see here, that it is actually in the street next to public buildings. That's a football stadium. That is next to that is a medical center, and beyond that is a day center for the disabled. So the idea is quite clearly to try and create a situation where it is impossible to respond to the threat without actually placing civilian buildings in danger. Here we see, for example, weapons being stored in mosques. We see weapons factories in civilian homes. Combatants dressing as civilians, clearly a violation of international humanitarian law. But here we actually have an official Hamas poster where a terrorist leader is dressed to all intents and purposes as a civilian. Recruiting of children particularly under the age of 15, a clear violation of international humanitarian law, and yet we have Hamas proudly declaring that it's recruited youngsters into the ranks of their forces. Human shielding. Again, there's a debate in the humanitarian community as to what specifically comprises human shielding, but there are some instances which go beyond any doubt whatsoever. Here is a remarkable piece of footage. I'll tell you in advance what you're going to see because it's very brief. It's a Hamas terrorist who wants to cross a road, and during the period of time that he will be crossing the road, he will actually be exposed. So his tactic in this particular case is to grab hold of a child and to use him as a shield to ensure that he will not be attacked while he's crossing the road. So let's just see this. There's the kid. In a moment we'll see the terrorist with a gun on his back. He picks up the kid, holds him in front of him as he crosses the road, and then of course casts him aside when he gets to the other side of the road. Other abuses of distinction, booby trapping. This large white map, it's actually a work map, a Hamas work map. It's very significant. It's the size of a table. If you look very carefully, you can see that faintly on the map are plans of civilian houses. And this is a map with a key that shows where explosives, wires, booby traps were actually planted, because specifically in the last week and a half of the conflict, the Hamas strategy was to try and draw in Israeli soldiers into build-up areas and to blow them up on them. And obviously you have to remember that these explosives are being planted in this area while civilians are actually living there. And one of the consequences, you can see on the right a house that's booby-trapped, wired up with explosives. One of the consequences of that is what are called euphemistically work accidents. Work accidents are houses in which there are factories that actually blow up because the manufacturing process or the bombs went off. You won't hear about that publicly, you won't hear about that in Palestinian statements, but you will read about it in the Arabic newspapers. And so here, for example, I've just put a list of work accidents, so-called, that took place just in December 2008. And what I think is particularly significant is the statistic down at the bottom. In the first week of the operation in Gaza, the first 5 days of the operation, between 6 and 7% of the missiles that were fired by Hamas actually landed within the Gaza Strip, didn't leave the Gaza Strip, so were actually Hamas firing missiles on the Palestinian population. What are lawful responses? Basically, international law, the law of armed conflict, says, as we mentioned before, that a military object doesn't cease to be a military object simply because it's in the heart of a civilian area. And you'll understand that that simply is not a workable tactic, because if that were to be the case, we would effectively be issuing an open invitation to every terrorist organization in the world to set up shop inside a school or a hospital or a kindergarten. These are some of the precautionary measures which I'm sure we'll hear more about later, taken by Israel: leaflets, flyers, warning systems, and so on and so forth. The principle of proportionality. Strikingly, there is no general principle of proportionality when you find yourself in an armed conflict. There is no obligation if America goes to war against Mexico that they have to leave 90% of their military back in mothballs because they're fighting a smaller military. On the other hand, when you do face yourself in a situation where civilians are in danger, then the principle of proportionality, the balance between the likelihood of civilian harm and the military advantage that you're trying to achieve, becomes extremely important. A couple of principles of proportionality: it's a forward-looking test, it's measured in relation to the overall objective of the attack, and it's the reasonable assessment of the military commander at the time. So the military commander has to think, am I protecting my civilians? Am I protecting my forces? Am I minimizing damage to civilians? Are there legal constraints on using this particular type of weapon at this time? Have I verified my intelligence? Are there humanitarian commitments? And this, of course, is particularly challenging when you have an abuse of this principle, as we saw with Hamas, when they become aware that a weapons factory is about to be targeted, moving dozens of civilians up onto the roof in order to try and change the proportionality equation and make it harder to attack. I won't play this, I have a clip here, but it's a chilling statement by Fathi Hamad, the Hamas leader, who proudly praises the women, the children, the elderly who have gone onto the roofs to protect their fighters, and who, he says, are saying, we desire death as you desire life. So what do you do in response to that? As I mentioned, there are a lot of warning mechanisms: flyers, phone calls, preliminary light attacks. But probably what's more significant than that, and I think it is worth just having a quick look at a brief part of a clip that was revealed by was released by the Air Force, needs the being willing to abort attacks when they become disproportionate. So here, for example, is a vehicle containing terrorists traveling. The pilot has him in his sights. When you see another crosshair, you'll see that a missile has been fired. But then all of a sudden the vehicle goes into this populated area, this series of huts. The pilot doesn't know whether the proportionality equation has now changed. There may be civilians here. So he actually diverts the missile to an empty part of the field nearby, blows up the missile there, not blowing up the terrorists, but ensuring that the civilians are protected. And on this clip there are quite a number of instances. Finally, a word about the principle of humanity. Obviously, Israel took significant measures, maybe we'll hear about them later, to try and ensure that there was humanitarian assistance during the conflict. This was particularly difficult, again, because of some of the challenges placed by Hamas, blowing up crossing points. These are just a list of attacks on crossing points, which are the lifeblood of humanitarian supplies. Use of ambulances as getaway vehicles. Again, another chilling clip. Here we see terrorists actually using an ambulance with Red Cross and UN facilities as a getaway vehicle. Another terrorist comes along with a gun, gets in the ambulance and uses it as his getaway vehicle. Use of, look on the right-hand side, medicine bottles as explosives and so on. Finally, I'll just say a word about why it's so difficult to conduct a genuine legal dialogue about these issues. On the one hand, I won't go through them, we have a Supreme Court which is genuinely struggling on a daily basis with how to find the appropriate balance. On the other hand, we have an international community which adopts a position that doesn't seem to leave room for dialogue at all. We have here a statement by the UN Secretary General. I acknowledge Israel's right and duty to protect its people against terrorist attacks. However, that duty should not be carried out in a way that increases suffering amongst the Palestinian people. Now that's a very classic UN statement. It sounds very balanced and even-handed. But confronting these threats, there is no response that does not increase suffering to some degree. The question has to be, what is a lawful, proportionate, appropriate response? The EU presidency issued a démarche urging Israel to refrain from activities that endanger civilians. Such activities are contrary to international law. Well, as I hope you'll hear today, that's simply not the case as a question of international law. There are situations when you can endanger civilian life, but it has to be proportionate, it has to be appropriate, it has to be justifiable, and so on. I have other quotes from the international community, but simply to revisit my earlier comment. One of the frustrations here is that we don't think that we have all the right answers. But I think as a general rule, Israel is trying to ask the right questions. And one of the tragedies is that there are very few forums in which we can engage in the genuine and serious debate that these questions require. And again, that's another reason why I personally appreciate the holding of forums like this, which can be the beginning of a dialogue of that nature. Thank you very much.